You can't always control the stage you're given, but you can always control the song you sing. Her name was called again. It happened faster than she expected. No warning, no countdown, no time to let her heartbeat settle. The stagehand's earlier whisper echoed in her head. They might change the order now. She knew they had. She rose. From the folding chair, the guitar feeling heavier than before. Her legs carried her toward the bright glow at the end of the corridor. Each step made the muffled music from the stage grow louder until it was all she could hear. The air was warm and dry under the lights, but her palms were cold as she neared. The curtain, a volunteer with a clipboard, leaned toward her. "You're on in 15 seconds," they said, barely glancing up. 15 seconds? It wasn't enough time to adjust, but it was enough to decide. She could walk out there as the girl from the first round, shaky, caught off guard, or she could walk out there as someone who had nothing left to lose. The audience's applause for the previous performer faded. Her cue came. She stepped forward, the black curtain brushing against her arm as she emerged into the light. The room looked different this time. It wasn't that the lights were brighter. It was that she was seeing everything clearly. Rows of faces, some leaning forward, some leaning back. A few with raised eyebrows like they were curious to see if she'd crash or rise. The host gave her a polite nod, but his tone was flat when he announced her name. It didn't matter. She was already moving to the center of the stage. The mic stand had been replaced. No more loose joints. Her fingers adjusted the height, smooth and steady. This time, she could almost feel the sound engineer watching her from his booth, waiting for a mistake. This time, she wasn't using the contest's track. She'd asked no, insisted to play her own guitar. The rulebook allowed it, though few contestants took that option. It meant the sound crew couldn't throw her off with a wrong key. It meant every note would be hers. She took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs until her shoulders lifted. Then she looked up and scanned the crowd, not for approval, not for permission, but for someone to sing to. She found a man in the middle row, sitting stiff with his arms crossed. She found a young girl in the front, swinging her legs and watching. With bright eyes, she found an older woman off to the side. Hands clasped like she was holding something precious. They would be her audience. The rest could fade away. Her fingers pressed the strings. And the first chord rang out. It was warm and steady. She didn't rush. She let the sound breathe, filling the space. Her voice came next, soft at first. No one laughed this time. They just listened. The song wasn't flashy. It wasn't built for high notes or vocal tricks. It was the kind of song you'd hear on a quiet night, driving with the windows down. A song about leaving home, but never losing the pieces of it you carry inside. Her voice moved through the verses like a slow river. Every word came from someplace real, the dusty roads she'd walked, the mornings she'd woken before sunrise to help in the fields, the quiet nights when music was her only companion. She didn't need the crowd to cheer. She just needed them to feel it, somewhere near. In the middle of the song, she noticed a change. The man with crossed arms had lowered them. The young girl in the front had stopped swinging her legs, her chin resting in her hands. The older woman had tears in her eyes. Blinking them away slowly, her fingers moved without thought. The guitar an extension of herself now. The chorus came again, richer than before. The sound filled every corner of the room. It wasn't perfect. A couple of notes buzzed.
Ow, one chord came a little late, but it didn't matter. It was alive, and it was hers.
She didn't look toward the sound booth until the last verse. When she did, she caught the engineer watching her with a look she couldn't read. Maybe surprise, maybe respect, maybe just the realization that the game had changed. The final chord faded into the air. She let it ring, not rushing to end it. The silence that followed was the good kind, heavy, still full of something unspoken. Then the applause started, small at first, then growing until it filled the room. It wasn't the wild cheering given to the flashier acts, but it was honest, and honest was all she'd ever wanted. She nodded once toward the crowd, stepped back from the mic, and walked toward the curtain. Her steps were lighter now. She didn't know if she'd won anything tonight, but she knew. She had walked out there on her own terms, and that was enough for now. The second round had ended hours ago. Now the hall was quieter, but not silent. The final showcase was about to begin. Only a few contestants had been called back, and she was one of them. She didn't know if it was because she'd earned it or because they wanted to test her again. Either way, she was going to sing like it was her last chance. Backstage, she tuned her guitar. The wood was cool under her fingertips, the strings humming softly as she adjusted them. The stagehand who'd given her the earlier warning passed by. "They're giving you the opening slot," he said quietly. She raised her eyebrows. Opening was risky. The audience was still. Settling in, the judges still finding their pens. But it was also a chance to set the tone. If she could make the room feel something from the first note, she could own the night. She stepped to the curtain. The smell of warm stage lights and polished wood filled her senses. Beyond the fabric, she heard murmurs, the shuffle of programs, the creak of chairs. It wasn't the roar of a crowd. It was expectation. And expectation could turn to either applause or silence. The host announced her name. This time, the tone was different. Not warm exactly, but not dismissive either. She walked out, the guitar strapped snug across her shoulder. The light hit her, and instead of shrinking, she let it wrap around her. Her eyes adjusted. Faces came into view, judges at their table, audience rows stretching. Into the shadows, some looked curious, others cautious. She wondered if they still remembered the girl from the first round with the wrong track. She reached the microphone, adjusted it without fumbling. Her hands rested on the guitar strings. For a moment, she just stood there. Still, the room waited. A cough came from somewhere in the back, then quiet again, and then she played just one note. Clear, warm, steady. It was nothing more than the first chord. But it was like a breath everyone had been holding was suddenly released. She let it ring before moving to the next. Her fingers were sure. Her timing unhurried. No one could rush. Her not tonight. When she began to sing, her voice didn't ask for permission. It entered the room like it belonged there, soft at first, but with an undercurrent of strength. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a show-off high note. It was honest, and it reached people before they even realized it. Her song was about standing in the rain, waiting for someone who might never come. It wasn't about love in the usual sense. It was about hope. The kind of hope that hurts but keeps you alive. Every word felt like it had been pulled from her own life. The verses moved like a slow walk down a familiar road. The chorus lifted, not in volume, but in weight. You could feel it in the way the sound filled the corners of the room. By the second verse, the audience wasn't shifting in their seats anymore. The older woman from before leaned forward, eyes glistening. A young man in the third row had stopped scrolling on his phone. His gaze fixed on the stage. Even the judges had stopped writing, their pens resting on paper. The sound engineer, visible behind the booth window, had his chin resting on his hand. She didn't know if he was thinking about what he'd done in the first round, but she saw him listening, really listening. Her fingers didn't tremble now. They pressed the strings with quiet certainty. Every pluck, every strum landed where it was meant to. The guitar and her voice were one sound, and that sound was filling the hall with something unshakable. The bridge came, the part where the lyrics turned from waiting for someone else to deciding to walk away. Her tone shifted slightly, a touch of steel beneath the softness. It was still gentle, but it carried the kind of resolve that can't be faked. The final chorus swelled. She didn't push for volume. She pulled for connection. She let each word sit for just a breath before moving to the next, and when she reached the last line, she didn't let it trail off. She held it long enough for the room to feel it in their bones. Then she let it go. Silence followed. The kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of what she'd just given them, full of what they'd just taken in. It lasted a heartbeat longer than most performers ever get. Then came the applause. Not scattered, not hesitant, steady, growing, warm. Some people stood. Some clapped with both hands like they were trying to make up for the first round. She smiled, not wide, not showy, just enough to acknowledge them, and in that moment, she knew she had made the first note count. Everything else had grown from it, and no one could take that from her. breaking the room's silence, 800 words. The sound of applause still echoed in her ears when she stepped back from the microphone. It wasn't the loudest applause she'd ever heard, but it was the most genuine. There was no pity in it, no polite clapping just to fill the air. This was the sound of people who had been moved. She stood there for half a breath longer than she needed to, letting the moment settle, letting herself feel it. Then she gave a small nod and turned to walk toward the side of the stage. The bright lights followed her for a few steps before fading. And that was when she heard it. The low murmur of voices, not the mocking whispers from before, but something softer. People were talking about her song. They weren't talking about her dress or her hometown or her mistakes. They were talking about the way her voice had made them feel backstage. The atmosphere was different this time. Some of the same contestants who had smirked earlier now kept their eyes on her as she passed. One of them, a tall guy with a sharp jawline, muttered, "Didn't see that coming." Another simply nodded at her, not quite smiling, but no longer dismissive. It wasn't friendship. Not yet, but it was a crack in the wall they'd built. Between them and her, she found a chair near the back wall. Away from the constant shuffle of people, the stagehand from before appeared again, holding a bottle of water that was different, he said, handing it to her. She raised an eyebrow. Different good or different bad? He smiled faintly. Different, like people aren't going to forget it anytime soon. She sipped the water, feeling the coolness wash away the dryness in her throat. For the first time all night, shoulders loosened, the tension that had sat in her chest since the first round began to lift. Through the thin curtain, she could still hear the audience talking between performances. Snippets floated back to her. "That song hit me right here," one voice said, followed by a soft laugh. "I wasn't expecting her to sound like that," another admitted, a third voice. Older simply said, "That girl's got something." Real. The next performer went on stage, and the music filled the hall again. But she noticed something. The crowd wasn't as restless now. They seemed more tuned in, more open. Maybe it was her imagination. But she felt like the mood had shifted, and she had been the one to tip it. When the performer finished, a few people backstage came over to her. A young woman with bright earrings leaned down. "I liked your song," she said quickly. It wasn't much, but the sincerity in her voice made it worth more than the words themselves. An older contestant, the same man with silver in his hair who'd spoken to her earlier, gave her a knowing look. "Told you survived the fire," he murmured before heading toward the stage for his own turn. She sat there, thinking about what had just happened. In the first round they had set her up to fail. In the second, she'd fought to control her own space. And now, in this final showcase, she had done something she didn't fully plan. She had changed the air in the room. It wasn't just about hitting the right notes or playing clean chords. It was about letting the audience see something honest. And once they'd seen it, they couldn't unsee it. She thought about the older woman in the audience who'd leaned forward with tears in her eyes. She thought about the young man who had put away his phone. She thought about the judges who had stopped writing and simply listened. Those were the signs, the proof that she had broken through. As the evening went on, more contestants performed. Some were technically better, some louder, some more theatrical. But she noticed a strange thing every time a song ended. There was a moment when a few heads turned toward her. It was like people were comparing what they'd just heard to what she had given them. She didn't know if that meant she was winning, but it meant she was in their minds, and that was enough for now. By the time the last act finished, the judges disappeared backstage to make their final notes. The host kept the audience busy with small talk and thank yous. She sat quietly, tuning her guitar again out of habit, though she wasn't sure she'd need it anymore. Her hands were steady now, no tremor left. Whatever happened next, she had made it further than they had expected her to. The sound engineer walked past her on his way out of the booth. For the first time all night, he stopped and looked directly. At her, there was no smirk, no trace of the earlier sabotage in his face. Just a brief nod, almost like an apology, before he moved on. When the host's voice boomed through the speakers, calling the contestants back on stage, she rose. The other performers lined up beside her, each holding their own nervous energy. The audience clapped as they came into view, standing under the lights again. She realized something. The fear that had followed her from the first round was gone. In its place was something quieter, but stronger. She had broken the silence. And the sound that followed was her own, the host's voice. Echoed across the stage, "Ladies and gentlemen, our final performer of the night." Her name followed, and the sound seemed to hang in the air longer than before. She felt it settle in her chest, not heavy like in the first round, but steady. This was it, the last song of the night. The last chance to leave a mark. The other contestants stepped back to the side of the stage. She moved forward, guitar strap across her shoulder. Her boots tapping softly against the polished wood, the lights rose, warm and bright. But this time, they didn't blind her. She could see the faces now, row after row, the familiar ones. From earlier and the new ones who had arrived late, some leaned forward, some sat with arms crossed. Their eyes were on her. That was all she needed. She adjusted the mic just slightly. Her fingers brushing the cool metal, a hush fell over the room, the kind that feels like everyone is waiting for something specific. She glanced at the judges' table, no pens moving, no quiet chatter between them. They were looking at her. Her hand found the first chord on the guitar neck. The note rang out, smooth and even. It wasn't loud, but it filled the space. She took a slow breath and began to sing. Her voice didn't race to the chorus. It walked there, each word steady. The song was about closing a chapter, about saying goodbye without bitterness. She sang about letting go of people who didn't believe in you, about walking away without needing them to see you win. It wasn't written for this competition. But as the words left her mouth, she realized how perfectly it fit. The earlier sabotage, the whispers, the looks, they were all inside the song now. So was the quiet pride she felt for still standing here, guitar in hand, her voice carried. Through the first verse, she didn't look at the smirking faces she remembered from round one. She didn't need to. Instead, she found the woman in the second row who had listened so intently before. She sang to her like they were the only two in the room. The first chorus rose and fell. The audience stayed quiet between lines. No coughing. No murmurs. It wasn't the silence of disinterest. It was the silence of people who didn't want to miss anything. As the second verse began, something shifted. Her fingers pressed a little firmer on the strings. Her voice opened just a little wider. She could feel the connection now, like an invisible thread running from her to the crowd. They were following her through every word. Even the host, standing at the edge of the curtain, had his head tilted slightly, listening when the bridge came. She let her voice drop to a near whisper. The room leaned in without realizing it. The lyrics spoke of being told, "You're not enough," and then finding out you've been more than enough all along. She didn't have to act the emotion. It was already there. Her throat tightened slightly, but she kept singing. The words were clear, honest, impossible to ignore. Then came the final chorus. She didn't make it louder. She made it truer. Every note was placed with care. Her strumming slowed, giving space between the lines, and then she reached the very last one. The final line of the song, the one she'd been building toward since the first chord, she sang it softly, but with a tone that filled every inch of the hall. It was only a few words, but they landed like the closing of a heavy door. And when the last syllable faded, she let the silence sit, not rushing to strum again. Not filling it with a thank you, she stood still, letting them feel it. For a moment, nothing happened. It was that rare kind of pause where everyone seems to hold their breath. And then it came, the sound, applause, strong and unbroken, rolling. Forward from the first row to the very back, it wasn't wild screaming. It wasn't scattered. It was unified. The sound of a room full of people agreeing that they'd just witnessed something worth remembering. Some stood, some clapped above their heads. She caught glimpses of faces, the man who had once crossed his arms now on his feet. The sound engineer clapping with a faint, almost shy smile. Even a couple of contestants from earlier were clapping. Without hesitation, she nodded once, a small smile tugging at her lips. Then she stepped back from the mic. Her boots tapped the wood again as she walked toward the wings. The lights dimmed behind her, but the applause kept going. Backstage. The stagehand met her with a grin that, he said, was a closer. She laughed softly, shaking her head. She didn't know yet what the judges would say. She didn't know if there would be a trophy or even a mention of her name. But she knew this. She had left them with the final line still echoing in their heads. And sometimes that was more powerful than winning. The applause was still fading when she stepped into the narrow, backstage corridor. The curtain fell shut behind her, muffling the noise of the audience. For a moment, she just stood there, guitar still strapped over her shoulder, her breath slow and steady. She hadn't realized until now how much tension had been living in her shoulders all night. It was gone, replaced by something lighter, not quite relief, not quite victory, just peace. The stagehand, who'd been quietly rooting for her all night, appeared at her side. He handed her a bottle of water with a small grin. "You know, you just changed the whole mood out there, right?" he said. She shook her head, smiling faintly. "I just sang." He raised an eyebrow. "Exactly." A few contestants passed by on their way to the stage. Some offered small nods, others quick pats on the shoulder. It wasn't friendship. Not yet, but it wasn't dismissal either. The wall between them and her had cracked. And she could feel it. She slipped into a folding chair in the corner from here. She could hear the muffled sound of the host announcing the next act. The audience clapped politely, but it didn't sound the same as before. She thought back to the silence right after her final line. It wasn't just that they'd liked her song. It was that, for a moment, she'd had the entire room breathing. In time with her, that feeling stayed with her now, like a warm ember. The older man with the silver hair, the one who'd told her to survive the fire, walked past. He stopped, leaning slightly on the back of a chair. "That was something," he said simply. She smiled. "Thank you." He gave a small nod, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Doesn't matter what happens next, they'll remember you." Then he was gone. Called to the stage for his turn, she leaned her guitar gently against the wall. For the first time all night, her hands weren't shaking. She took a long sip of water and let herself just be still. The competition, the lights, the sabotage in the first round, it all felt far away now. What mattered was that she had stood there and sung like she meant it. Minutes stretched into an hour as the last acts performed. Finally, the host's voice rang out again. "Ladies and gentlemen, will all of tonight's performers please join me on stage for the results?" Her stomach gave a small, nervous twist, not because she needed to win, but because walking out there again meant facing all those faces one last time. She stood, adjusted the guitar strap on her shoulder, and followed the others toward the light. The line of contestants formed across the stage. The crowd applauded as the host moved down the row. Speaking briefly about each performance when he got to her, he paused. "This next performer," he said, "reminded us tonight that sometimes the simplest moments can be the most powerful." There was another ripple of applause. Warmer this time, she dipped her head in a small nod, her lips curling into a quiet smile. The judges had their envelopes now. The host took them. Shuffling the papers with theatrical slowness, she could feel the anticipation in the air. The audience leaning forward, the contestants holding their breath. The first award went to the most technically skilled singer, the second to the most original song. And then came the final category, the Audience Choice Award. "This one," the host said, "isn't about the highest note or the fastest run. It's about the person who left the biggest mark on the people in this room tonight." He opened the envelope, looked up and smiled. The pause was short but deliberate. Then he said her name. For a second, she didn't move. The sound of the applause washed over her. People were standing, not everyone, but enough to make her heart race. The older woman in the second row clapped with tears in her eyes. The man who had once crossed his arms was now smiling, and in the back, even the sound engineer was on his feet. She stepped forward to take the small glass trophy. It wasn't heavy, but it felt solid in her hands. The host leaned in. "Anything you'd like to say?" She thought for a moment, then spoke into the microphone. "Thank you for listening," she said simply. No speech, no long story, just the truth. The applause rose again. She stepped back into the line. Trophy in hand. It didn't matter that. It wasn't the top prize, this was the award chosen by the people who had heard her and felt something. And for her, that meant more than any title. When the show ended and the audience began to leave, a few people came up to her as she packed her guitar. One woman said, "Your song made me think of my sister. I haven't spoken to her in years, but I'm going to call her tomorrow. A man in a worn baseball cap told her that last line. I'm never going to forget it. Each word they shared was worth more than the trophy. She left the hall with the night air cool on her face. The streets were quiet, the city lights reflecting in the windows. She carried her guitar on her back and the small trophy in her hand. But the real prize was something invisible, the knowledge that she had walked into that contest a target for failure, and walked out as someone they would remember. The night air was cool, carrying the faint hum of traffic from streets beyond. The quiet block, she walked slowly, guitar on her back, trophy in one hand, the other tucked into her coat pocket. Her steps echoed on the pavement, each one feeling lighter than the last. It wasn't because of the award, though. It was still a surprise to feel its weight in her hand. It was because of everything that had happened before she walked out of that building. She reached the corner and paused beneath a street lamp. The glow pooled around her boots, soft and gold. She thought about the first round, the wrong track, the loose mic, the laughter. She thought about the moments she'd almost stepped off stage before singing a single line. If she had, tonight wouldn't exist. She wouldn't be here, carrying proof that she could stand in the fire and not burn. A car slowed at the curb and a woman leaned out of the passenger window. You were the girl with the guitar, right? She called. She nodded, and the woman grinned. That last song. It made me cry. Then the car pulled away, leaving her with a small, stunned smile. She walked on, turning toward the quiet side streets. Each step brought back flashes of the night, the faces in the audience, the moment the room went still. The warmth and the applause, the woven between those moments, was something else. The people who had tried to make her stumble, the whispers, the smug looks, the sound engineer's early sabotage. It wasn't bitterness she felt now, it was a strange gratitude. They had pushed her harder than she'd ever been pushed. And because of that, she had found something in herself she might not have otherwise. Back home, her small apartment smelled faintly of coffee from the morning. She set the trophy on the kitchen table, the guitar leaning beside it. For a long time, she just looked at them. Not as prizes or possessions, but as reminders. One of what she carried in her hands, and one of what she carried in her heart. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from her mother lit the screen. Saw the video online. You didn't just sing, you told the truth. She read it twice. Letting the words settle in, that was it. That was what mattered most. It wasn't the notes or the chords or the lighting. It was telling the truth in a way that other people could feel. Over the next few days, small signs of that truth kept appearing. An email from a stranger. Your song reminded me of the night I left home and everything I felt on that bus ride. A social media post from someone in the audience. She sang like she was talking to my heart. None of them mentioned the contest rankings. No one cared where she'd placed. They cared about the connection. One evening, she stopped by the same small diner she'd worked in before moving to the city. The waitress behind the counter recognized her immediately. Heard you were in some big competition, she said. Pouring coffee, she nodded. Yeah, I was. The waitress leaned on. The counter? Did you win? She thought for a moment, then smiled. In the way that mattered, it wasn't until weeks later, sitting in a park with her guitar, that she realized the full lesson she was carrying. She strummed a few quiet chords as the winter sun slid. Low in the sky, the breeze was cool against her face. A few people passing through the park slowed to listen. No stage, no lights, no judges, just her voice in the open air, and yet it felt the same as that final night at the competition. Because the truth she had found wasn't about where she sang or how many people listened. It was about showing up fully, even when it would be easier to step back. She knew there would be other contests, other rooms full of strangers, other moments where the deck was stacked against her, but now she understood something she hadn't before when they tried. To set her up to fail, she had a choice. Let them decide her worth, or decide it herself. That choice was hers every time, and no one could take it away. As the sun dipped and the park grew quieter, she finished the song she'd been playing. A little girl sitting on a bench clapped shyly, her mother smiling beside. Her, the girl called out. That was pretty, she grinned. Thank you. It was simple. But it reminded her of something: you never know who you might reach. Even in the smallest moments later, back in her apartment. She picked up the trophy from the table. She turned it in her hands, feeling the smooth glass catch the lamplight. Then she set it back down beside her guitar. They would stay there, side by side, not as proof that she had won anything, but as proof that she had shown up, sung her truth, and left a mark. That was the lesson she carried, and the one she hoped others might take too.